Muito bom dia, pessoas queridas que nos acompanham já no penúltimo dia do 25º Congresso Nacional da Associação Brasileira de Educação Musical. Nessa manhã, nós vamos ter a presença do professor Peter Renshaw e do professor Sean Gregory, ambos do Reino Unido, conversando sobre engajamento social, educação musical e engajamento social. Eles foram entrevistados alguns dias atrás pelas professoras Heloisa Feichas e Flávia Narita. Nós vamos passar o vídeo com as legendas para que vocês possam acompanhar e, em seguida, eles estarão aqui conosco para conversar, debater e discutir. Eles serão apresentados no vídeo. Para nós é uma honra recebê-los. O professor Peter Renshaw, ele vem trabalhando com o conceito de engajamento social há praticamente 40 anos. O Sean Gregory foi seu discípulo, tem colocado esse conceito em ação, sendo vice-diretor da Guildhall School e também atuando no Barbican Center, em Londres. Então, vamos acompanhar a entrevista que foi feita. Em seguida, a gente volta para o debate. Gente, um minutinho só, que a gente vai fazer alguns ajustes técnicos aqui para que o som possa sair para vocês, tá? Tá saindo sem áudio, porque quando a gente compartilha a tela, a gente precisa clicar para que o áudio seja compartilhado, e a gente vai fazer isso para que vocês possam não só ficar lendo em silêncio durante todo esse tempo, mas que vocês possam ouvir todo o processo. Então, como eu estava dizendo, vão ser falados nos vídeos também sobre alguns textos, livros do que o professor Peter Renshaw e que o Sean Gregory editaram. Eles gentilmente mandaram links para esses textos e para esse livro, e o Mário vai colocar aqui nos comentários para vocês que vocês possam baixá-los. Vamos ver se agora o áudio sai para vocês. Good morning, you all in Brazil. Good afternoon for our teachers in England. We are very happy and very honored to receive today Professor Peter Renshaw and Professor Sean Gregory to discuss an important theme that is social engagement. So important to our theme of this year in ABEM, and the importance of it to build another world. Here in Brazil, science has been one of the main weapons and hopes in these times, despite suffering constant attacks in the current Brazilian scenario. In this scenario, music not only integrates this movement, but also presents itself more and more as one of the important areas to act and transform contexts, times, cultures, places, strongly victimized by the crisis of the current world. It is at this scene that music education, more specifically, needs to assume its social responsibilities and its potential for building another world, mediating and reconfiguring the relationships between human beings, between cultures, between humanity and the planet on which we live. So, to talk about this, I would like to invite Dr. Heloisa Feichas, professor of music education at the Music School of the Federal University of Minas Gerais. She has a master and a doctorate degree in music education at the Institute of Education of the University of London, and also Dr. Flávia Narita, professor of music education at the music department of the University of Brasilia. She also has a master's and a doctorate degree in music education, also in the Institute of Education of the University of London. So thank you, Professor Heloisa and Professor Flávia, for being here with us and for mediating this important meeting with Professor Peter Renshaw and Professor Sean Gregory. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really, really nice to have this chance to talk to Peter and Sean. And I'd like just to say little things about them. So Peter Renshaw has been a very important mentor in my life. So I must say this personally first. So it's a great honor, and I'm really glad to have him. It's hard for me to speak about Peter's career and curriculum, but just to make it very short, Peter has been written about music, arts, and social engagement, and he's been researching a lot about this at Guildhall School of Music and Drama for many years. He was responsible for many changes in Guildhall School. He was the principal of the Yehud Menuhin School many years ago. He was a lecturer in philosophy of education at the University of Leeds. So he has a long career reflecting about these things we are going to talk today. And he's been also a consultant for many orchestras and organizations. And later on, we can send to everybody a link of his books and writings. I think it's going to be nice for everybody to address properly through his writings. And also another important person in my personal career is Sean Gregory. Sean, he's been responsible for developing and delivering a range of innovation, research and knowledge exchange, and wider lifelong learning programs across Guildhall School of Music and Drama. He was the director of creative learning for some time, head of the Center for Creative and Professional Practice and head of professional development at Guildhall. And now his position has changed a little bit. He's the vice principal and director of innovation and engagement at Guildhall School of Music and Drama. So I'd like to invite both of them. And of course, if you want to add something about your work, if I didn't say it properly, please do it. As for Peter, for me, it's very hard to say because it's such a big curriculum, long one. And so welcome, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And I'd like to start just asking both of you, what is social engagement connected to, music education or art education? What does it mean really to work with social engagement perspective?
Well, that's a good question. I want to go back, if I may, to what Marcus said in his introduction, when he was looking at the importance of music education and the arts after this present crisis, with the pandemic. And I just would like to add 2 points to that. I look at the world at the moment, and obviously wherever we are, we want to change things, because nothing could be worse in a way than where we're at the moment. So it raises so many political, economic, cultural, social, and moral issues, particularly moral issues. And so I think the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and climate change, they have totally transformed the world. And I think we need to engage a lot more now with the voice of young people, because it's their world. The world is no longer changing, it has changed. And old people like me, we're off the planet, really. And I'm just to reflect what's really going on. And the arts can't resolve everything, of course they can't, but they can make a major contribution to enhancing the quality of life of people wherever they are. So I think we have a moral responsibility in the arts to get our act together and to really begin to engage with people. And this is not just through schools and young people. It's, for me, the social engagement covers, give you just a list of psychiatric hospitals, prisons, prevention for young people with young offenders, the whole mental crisis with and hospices for terminal illness. You go through a long list of organizations and, for ordinary people who may not want to go to concerts and things, but they can in fact begin to marry up their performance skills, however simple, with composing, with improvising, and really releasing their own creative energy. I think that's what it's partly about. It brings people in touch with who they are. So it raises questions to do with identity, sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. It gives people a direction, it gives them meaning in life. And I think for me, social engagement is about that. What it is much wider than community engagement. Community engagement is very, is a subset really of social engagement. It's very important, but it's to do with one's probably more immediate community. And I work a lot and still do in the world of criminal justice. Well, that may not be local, it may not be community at all. It's much wider than that. And then the other, what I call a fashionable academic construct, there's a lot of talk at the moment about artistic citizenship. Now, I've been asking a lot of past leaders in the UK, what the hell do people mean by artistic citizenship? And none of the people I've been working with at the top of the trade have a clue what it means. I know where it comes from. It's from an American academic, philosopher of education. I don't know whether he knows what he's on about, but it's a word to avoid in my book. I know someone very well who is doing a PhD on artistic citizenship. Well, I'd like to know what it means. And so for me, I'm committed to social engagement and how the arts can really work in society to make the world a better place and to transform people's lives. And I don't feel an artistic citizen. And I've been in this game for about 60 years. Amen on that one.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for this very provocative introduction. Very nice. Sean, what would you say about this?
It's always hard to follow Peter because he's covered everything one go. But I would just add and just thinking about it from particularly the practitioner, the musician, the artist, and how you as an individual, as a musician, engage not just with your music, that is obviously a key part, or your art, and not, as Peter say, not just with your immediate community or even that school that you're in. You are connecting with life, you are connecting with people, and your ability to respond to people, to the context and the situation that you're in, and to bring that alive and to bring some meaning to that through the music making that follows, the education processes that follows that, is really key. None of these things can be done in isolation. And again, that's been shown more and more, what's been happening over the last 18 months, 2 years. It's a shared, collaborative experience. Everyone has something to give. And if you, as the lead practitioner and the musician, can catalyze that in the right way, using your skills as a musician, but also using your skills as a socially engaged practitioner, someone who has the emotional intelligence and the willingness and the openness to respond what is there in the room at that moment with those people, and you build something from that rather than something premeditated and over-prepared that you've brought in, and that's what you're going to do regardless of what anyone else thinks.
Great. Flávia, would you like to make some comment or ask something?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the opportunity for being here. So thank you, Marcus and Heloisa and Peter and Sean, for the opportunity to be here with you guys. And also thank you, Mari, for being helping us with all this and the whole event. And I have to say that you have already started pointing out some of the things that I think that are very, very important and essential to our current lives, right? When you say about engaging with music and through music to make the world a better place, and of course, I think it touches everyone, mainly people who are conscious about what's been happening in our country during this pandemic. I think it's one thing that was explicit is the gap, the huge gap between the poor and the others, the richer ones, and how the pandemic affected the poorest ones, and also not only in terms of course, it is financially, but also in terms of access to information and right information. And then we see that we were kind of flooded with lots of fake news. And how can we change this scenario, or how can we act upon this? And through our art, right, through music, how can we contribute to make people aware of what is going on or not? So I think it's very much in tune with both definitions of what would be the social engagement, and I think that it well, in my view, in terms of artistic citizenship, I understand the meaning of that through artistic involvement, you try to enact you being an active person acting in your context. So this is my understanding of this term, and then in this way, I think it's very much in tune and of what you both described. And I would just say that for there was a person here who coined the term of florestania, coming from forest, so people from the forest. So perhaps it would be a loose translation of forests and sheep, that we should defend the people from the forest and not and engage with the original people who are struggling, just to say that, well, we were here, we've been invaded a long time ago, and now we want to have our voices being heard, and not only our voices, our culture. And so I think it's a whole movement to make us aware that there are others here. And if we think about Brazil, when we say that as a melting pot, for example, I don't feel that I am melted, because just to look at me, I'm not really, so who are the Brazilians? What would a Brazilian would look like, right? So I have a Japanese background. My culture is Brazilian. It's a mix, but then is it really, what is the dominant culture? What is the dominant voices? And are we still being colonized by values and beliefs of perhaps Western, white, European music? Are we giving space for that? So I think that all of this means social engagement, and I would tie this with artistic citizenship. So I'm of course, I'm not going to be talking about this a lot, but I would like to hear you about more, a little bit more about these topics that you mentioned. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement, and also I mentioned that the forest people, right? You mentioned the environmental crisis, and how do you think, both of you, think that we can make a difference through our art, through music, and through music education? Thank you very much.
Sean, you go. Sure.
No, that's really very interesting what you're saying, Flávia. In no particular order, just on that last question, and I think just recently the word has become a bit lost, partly because it's become overused. But for me, and I'm speaking from my own background as a musician, which started as a composer, pianist and composer, but my imperative, my social and moral purpose, which wasn't something that I had to force out of myself, it just flowed at the moment I met Peter and came across his course, because it brought so many things together, and that wasn't a melting pot of things, exactly as you said. It was a sort of things connected all of a sudden, and things made sense. And the kernel, the heart of it, was creativity, and the creative imperative of engaging with other people, the creative imperative that sits within music making, whether you're playing repertoire or whether you're creating from nothing, and building something from scratch or whatever. And it's, of course, at this time, this was in the late 80s and early 90s, it was in some ways it was quite a new, it wasn't a new thing in terms of what creativity is, but in terms of how a creative experience was being presented, a creative experience in music making within the context of the school, with a national curriculum that was advocating finally performance, composition, and listening, with education programs that were being introduced, orchestras, opera companies, and elsewhere, that weren't just education experiences where you received things. It was about a two-way processing, and it demanded a different approach and a different type of practitioner. Now, I don't want to go through the whole history, but I think that was a very important kernel for me personally. That's where it started to make sense and has sort of moved things on. So your creative imperative, which is your creative imperative as a human being, and embracing change, recognizing change, and working with that rather than pushing it away, whatever your age, and recognizing where that's coming from, where those voices and people need to be heard. And that could be through the pure music making, or that can be obviously just through the engagement, the social engagement, and the people in the room, and everything I was saying earlier on. And the other thing, and I'll stop in a moment, but just playing on this creativity is, and I think it's playing into your melting pot point again, of it is, it's not, and God knows, but Peter in particular has worked so hard over the years, particularly in our Connect days, to try and capture what is this music? What's its style? What's its genre? Because we were saying it was sort of non-genre specific, non-style specific. It was oral as much as it was notated, you know, etc., etc. Improvisational as much as it was set. And we talked about a combination of languages and otherness, whatever. So I don't want to get bogged down in that now, but I think ensuring that the environments that we go into and that we create, we provide, we offer for music making to happen allows all of these things to come to the surface, and not so it becomes a pseudo classical piece or a pseudo jazz or even a pseudo folkloric based thing. You might draw on those influences, but they are immediately translating into something that means something to those people in the room, and the sound and the creation that's happening in that moment. And that requires a very skilled and particular type of approach and openness.
I think Sean has said it all, really. And going back to your point, Flavia, and you're obviously troubled, understandably, by what you might call white supremacy. And there's been a lot about that over the last 2 years. If you look at my book list at the moment, I've got stacks of books on black literature, trying to understand the past, to move from just an awareness of different cultures to try to really understand it. And it's very difficult. I think probably you could throw the book at me and criticize me for tokenism. That everything I've been doing, I've been playing a certain game by certain rules, and you might call it tokenism. I don't think that's my intention, but there's that danger. I think when Sean talks about this creative imperative, everything our music leaders have been doing over the years, there's been really unlocking the creative voice of whatever group of people you're with, maybe with homeless people, it may be with refugees, migrants, prisoners, men in prisons. We've done some incredible projects. This is with my criminal justice hat on, and it's called the Lullaby Project, which actually started in Carnegie, then moved to Chicago Symphony Orchestra, and the Irene Taylor Trust artistic director went out there and brought this Lullaby Project back to UK. And we've done this with refugees, with asylum seekers, with fathers in prison, and women who have come out of prison. They all have their stories to tell. And the skill of the musicians is not to stamp any particular mold on them. Maybe with males in prison, there'll be more hip hop, there'll be more rap. It won't be Beethoven's symphonies or late Beethoven. That's not going to happen. So we're not stamping something from an alien culture onto others. It's very much working from the hearts and minds of the individual people in that space. With homeless people, some incredible work has been done, and they have stories to tell, and they will tell the stories in their way. So really, in that sense, you're looking at their creativity and their voice, and you're unlocking that. And that requires incredible skill from the leaders, the music leaders, who have incredible breadth and facilitation skills, and also empathy, compassion. They can really relate to people and get on the inside of people fairly quickly, and then create something with integrity. The whole thing is a very serious game, and integrity and honesty and trust are at the center of this. And one's capacity to listen, to get them to reflect on themselves and their lives. And everybody, from very young children to old people like me, we have things to say. And I think you begin to develop the language, the musical language or the artistic language. Sometimes it's a marriage of poetry, dance, theatre, and music. You know, it is very cross, or can be cross-disciplinary. And I think the issues in the last year and a half have raised all these questions. You made them in Brazil, the rich and the poor, the social divide. England is riddled with social divide. We're one of the best countries in the world at social class. It's got much, much worse. But when you get people working together like this, those differences, the gaps, can go, at least momentarily. So for me, actually, I've always been morally driven, which probably sounds very pompous, but you know, I want to make a difference somehow. And I don't actually run workshops. I just talk about the damn things. And it's people like Sean, they do the work. I create the circumstances and the environment for things to happen. And I'll give you an example if I'm not going on too long. I chair a board called Drumworks. And this is largely with younger people. And you can look up that Drumworks on the web. We had a board meeting the other night. And there was a girl of 20 came. She had actually written herself, and it didn't take her very long, a 4-page document on our social media strategy. She did this, 20-year-old, presented it to the board. I interviewed her 4 years ago when she was left school. She was very angry at school. She hated school. She would play truant from school and was excluded from school and put in a pupil referral unit. And the one thing she could not do when she was in that unit was play with Drumworks. Drumworks was her family. Drumworks with who that rescued her from her negativity. And she's now a leader, going into schools and leading herself, and also got this incredible mind at delivering a strategy. Now, that's one example of the impact an arts organization can have on young people. Just one example, but it's a very, very powerful one. And I found it very moving, really, to hear her in action. So, over to you.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, this is long, could be a long conversation, but I just would like to ask you both to speak a little bit about how can we implement or change the mentality of our faculties of music, conservatoires, to really embrace this idea, this perspective of working with social engagement and to work with collaborative, creative learning. As in Brazil, for me, at least from my experience, it's really hard to work in this way because normally people are too much individualistic. The approach is very individual. And the student, the music student, normally he has this position of being individual. I have to practice my instrument, I go to my classes and I go to my lectures, So to open for this possibilities of really change the culture in this way, as you have long experience in Guildhall working with this, what could you say to us, like an advice, how can we change this based on your own experience in doing this for many years?
Sean.
Well, there would be a long answer to that, Louise, but maybe you could give one or two examples. And Peter was very involved with this as well, because it isn't easy, and there's a push and pull both ways. I mean, it's a fundamental principle, and it took a long time to learn. Obviously, we need to catalyze things as staff, as leaders within the institution, and that needs to come. But so much of the progress comes from the students' own motivation as well. So it's always keeping in touch with what the students are thinking about and what they are saying too. It's, you know, that can come in various ways, but I think a lot of the most exciting changes really came once with the students on board and making those pushes themselves. I think, you know, going way back, the analogy I often use is you're opening doors for students just to look through and then maybe walk through. But in the first instance, I personally feel, and it feels up and down still, even in our own country with the Guildhall, that we, as conservators, we have a moral obligation to ensure that all our students, all our music students, during their training, whatever their focus, whatever their dreams and ambitions as a soloist, as an orchestral musician, is for them to have the opportunity to reflect on and to have an experience of how their skills can be used and deployed and engage people in different ways. To have a student who might go through college for 4, 5, 6 years and to come out at the other end having essentially only focused on their principal study and all that comes with their principal study in terms of ensembles, maybe orchestra, their end of year recitals, and maybe some academic work alongside. That is so disconnected now to what the world is about, and dare I even say the employability of students. Now, it may be different in Brazil, but there's not a job for life anymore, and there hasn't been for quite a while. So it actually comes back to this creative imperative. So the curiosity, you want to tap into the curiosity, you want to be asking students the right questions, and your staff colleagues, to make sure that this is alive at all time. And then you provide, and this is where you need to negotiate within, with the curriculum, within your own departments, where you can create some space, ideally timetabled space for the students, where they go out and perform, lead workshops, run projects in different contexts. And that experience is contextualized as strongly as possible in relation to their overall imperative ambitions and dreams as a musician. They can't be seen as separate things. I came here to study my violin. Why on earth would I go out here and spend a day or a few weeks or whatever in this context? So the collaboration and the dialogue that comes with that, with you and the students and other members of staff across the faculties, Peter could say so much more because he was at the coalface right at the start. That's there where you start to look for your allies and people who will understand and will support that. Allyship is such an important part of everything around Black Lives Matter and all that's coming at the moment. You need the people who are going to advocate and support and act and do things on behalf of these movements, whether it's a movement around race and equity, or whether it's a movement around the creative imperative, the social engagement and imperative that comes with a music student. You can do it incrementally. You can start with optional experiences, then you can start to bed it down as something that might become a compulsory part of the learning and training whilst you're on that course and in that institution.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think is very important in this perspective is creating partnerships, also outside the institution, right? Because here in Brazil, I don't think it's so easy to, this culture of creating partnerships. As I saw in London, in Guildhall, when I was there, you had partnerships with different organizations, establishing, connections to develop and deliver projects from the students inside the conservatoire, the Guildhall and creating projects with public schools or, other kind of institutions. So this, for me, it was really nice to see, as here, for me, it was not easy when I tried, So I think this is crucial to how to make these partnerships.
Well, this is a. I'm not going to talk about the student thing. I mean, Sean has done that. I want to look at the wider context, which includes creative partnerships. I think the person who is leading these development, people like yourself and Flavia, you have to be very politically engaged within the institution and outside the institution. And in my early days, I was heavily involved with certain funding bodies, which were quite powerful. The funding bodies I knew, like the Gulbenkian Foundation, they were streets ahead of thinking in relation to arts organizations. And there was a political and moral motivation there. I was always very close to our Arts Council. I don't know whether you have an Arts Council, but the Arts Council in those days of Great Britain, I was the chair of the Education Committee for about 9 years. So I was really in the hot seat outside the institution, and I nurtured those connections because in a way it gave me legitimacy in relation to my institution, all the stuff I was doing within the institution. Well, there was another point. I was on the committee of the Arts Council in 1986, which said that all revenue-funded clients, orchestras, opera companies, theatres, dance companies, receiving public money, they all had to do education or community work. That was part of getting their money. Of course, very few of them had a clue what to do. And the staff in the orchestras and things weren't trained to do anything. So we became, the Guildhall, my team, very instrumental in training up people. And I advised endless orchestras and other arts organizations about the kind of movement that they could be doing. So I had a political role and a role to really engage with as many people outside the institution, which gave me a degree of credibility. I don't know whether I had much credibility within the institution, but I did have the ear of the principal. I mean, most people in the teachers saw me as a pain in the neck. I mean, I was just asking too many awkward questions, but it's very, very interesting. I never talk about my Menuhin School experiences, but of course, being the principal of the Menuhin School gave me credibility in an area which people respected. And they could not understand why I was getting my hands dirty in the community. Although at the Menuhin School, I introduced a lot of social engagement. We even had kids going down coal mines to understand different culture. And so I think that the person leading on all this has to understand Sean's point about the creative imperative, certainly understand the issues coming up in the world at the moment, but have this wider political acumen to make things happen. And within the institution, it comes down then to leadership. From the top, it needs to be an inclusive kind of leadership. And I think one of the tests is the leader capable, or whoever's running all this, capable of choreographing an institutional conversation. I'm a great sucker for conversation. I probably talk too much, but engaging with people is very, very important. To listen, to build the trust, as we said before, but to listen and reflect with people and constantly almost repeating yourself time and time again with different groups of staff. I think now, and Sean is much closer to this than I am, I'm just a voyeur, I think the conservatism within conservatoires is almost worse than ever. And I think many, many students, as you've said yourself, Heloisa, are very conservative. You've said this yourself. And I think it's interesting. There may get greater radical thinking from certain kinds of musicians working in the field who are in the coalface, confronting major issues every day. And there's a huge job to be done, I think, in terms of leadership and culture. The culture of most of these organizations is in the 19th century. Now, Sean may come back and say, actually, things have shifted. They've changed a bit. And I would acknowledge that, but we've still got a hell of a long way to go. And that really means leadership of the ability to listen and be empathetic, but also to be an activist. Basically, I think one has to be an activist. Sorry to say that. It's probably not a word that people want to hear. And in Brazil at the moment, you need some activists.
Oh yeah, no, we need that. Yes, more than ever.
What we do here, look at our government. No comment.
No comment here as well. No comment. It's a tragedy. No. Yes, Sean, could you speak a little bit more about this leadership?
Yes, I mean, I do always try and sort of say things have moved on, and they have in many ways, but there is still, I think, particularly within the core musical training of the core musical training paradigm of a conservatoire, or of higher music training, as it were, that is still locked in the 19th century, because a lot of the repertoire, even if it's not 19th century, it's more training. The models are still very based around that. They've come through the Industrial Revolution. They came through a lot of those models through the 18th and 19th century, with a lot of thought around community and engagement, wider engagement as well. But like many things, they've ossified, they become tied to a concert hall and a certain type of experience, and that becomes a sort of rite of passage. If you're going to make it as a musician, that's your way in. And you can apply it, I think, in different ways. It's very different in one sense, but in the world of jazz and even the pop industry itself, which is really quite, in literal terms, it can be quite narrow, and it's always about trying to get beyond those things. The thing I just wanted to there's two things I want to say, because I don't want to lose your leadership question, and obviously we're a school, Guildhall is a school of music and drama, and what we're now referring to as production arts rather than technical theatre. And actually, Peter will know from his day, those departments were really quite steeped in tradition, in the way that acting was taught and the way that technical theatre was done. There's been a real turnaround in that area, in both those areas, over the last few years. And actually, just last night, there was a celebratory event for graduates of this year and last year who'd missed out their graduation from production arts, and seeing their work. And literally the social engagement, it's not just the technical side of putting a show on, it's all sorts of other interventions coming. And the director, the leader of that department, a guy called Andy Lavender, what was a very intelligent and moving speech, cited equity and inclusion and the environment as the two leading things in terms of where it was going to take them in terms of what they're training students for and what it is they're focusing on. And this is key. He didn't present it as a top-down thing, which we can still be guilty of. It came from within. I said this to this morning. He felt it was coming from the ground upwards, and it was based very much in terms of how he was collaborating with his students. And I think there's a similar thing in drama as well. Now, in some ways, you could argue that's a bit easier once you sort of cracked it in the first instance, because there's a lot of ensemble and company based. It's quite familial, and there's a lot of working together through intensive project periods. Music training, as we know, and you've been referring, it's different. I mean, I would argue one way forward, and again, both Peter Renshaw and Peter Weigel were doing this from very early on. Lucy has done it through the rock and pop. It's the more ensemble and group-based music making you do, the more when you are with other people in the room, which is the basis of music, where it came from, communities, the folkloric tradition, all of these things, it's what kept you alive a long time ago. So some of those principles, I think the more we can bring those things back in, of course you need to work on your technique and your skills and all your craft and everything else. But I think the connection between those two things could be opened up, along with the contexts that musicians are given the opportunity to perform in, to create, to lead in. And that plays right back to the partnerships that you've just been referring to as well, Louisa. That needs a very different sort of leadership, and a very different mindset in terms of how you present that student, so they still feel they're coming to be the best possible musician or the best possible actor or whatever, and that they will be employable, there will be opportunity, but actually it brings more meaning, because we can talk about the success stories, and God knows, again, Peter's talked about this for years, of those who do make it, but what about the 80 or 90% who don't make it into an orchestra, and what do they start to feel in terms of their own self-worth? What was the point of that, even failure? And again, we're still there's a long way to go in that, in terms of getting beyond it being you either make it or you don't, or maybe you'll do a bit of education and teaching instead.
Yes, that's great. Flávia, would you like to add something?
Well, it's just wonderful to listen to this talk, and lots of things that, well, Sean has just mentioned and Peter has mentioned before, and then my question is, okay, yes, and this has been highlighted about being together, and then to promote, as much as we get together, we get to know each other, and then we learn, right, about our differences, our similarities. We learn about respecting point of views, musical tastes. But then my question is, what about during the pandemic, that in music we have been obliged to be apart, and even ensemble practices are happening virtually, but it's actually like we send an individual recording and video recording, and then there's another guy who's going to put everything together. It's beautifully the final product, but actually it has been made usually, right? It's an individual work. And so my thought first would be that, okay, so we are kind of selling an image of togetherness, right? The feeling when I as an expector, I feel good about seeing people playing together on the screen, but I know that this hasn't really happened. So it's a way to get around things, but it's not really the same as being together and playing. So my first question is about this the effectiveness of this togetherness, which is this remote practice. If you think that it is in a way that it's getting similar results as if because we are in a way listening to each other, not at the same time, not synchronously, but we are trying to continue making music together. And another point that I would like to raise is about when you said about the success of some students. So success of as a musician, then is it related to the employability that it was mentioned before, or are we talking about, because I think that was one thing that you said that really touched me, and I think the success for me, and I understood that for you guys as well, is to be a better human being, right? So a person who is morally and ethically engaged with the humanity, and not only about, okay, I'm going to it's a competition and I want to get a place in the orchestra or whatever, and then I'm going to have a place, but perhaps I am miserable because I don't have that social skills or whatever. So it's about this. And how do you think that it was affected during the pandemic, and even with this remote thing? And there are many other things. Perhaps this talk could go forever. It's just been wonderful to listen to you guys. But I'm going to stop for now so that you can talk about this. Thank you.
Can I take the first point, Sean? I mean, you're much closer to things, obviously, than I am. But my engagement over the last 2 years, quite heavy engagement on the criminal justice. So I'm very, very interested in prevention and the mental health issues that go with that, and prison and rehabilitation after prison. And the other one is this, my Drumworks log, which has brought me in touch with younger people. Obviously, during the pandemic, I was amazed, because I'm not technical at all. I find Zoom like this for me is an incredible challenge. Basically, I just want a strong whiskey to sort of recover from everything. But I think that I was very, very impressed with the creativity of the musicians I was observing and their digital knowledge and how they made things happen. It was incredible what was going on, and great credit to them. But there's always a but. With the Drumworks, several months went by when they were doing this, and many of the young people, of course, did not have drums at home, so they were in the kitchens banging different things, and somehow or other, the artistic leaders made some music out of it. But then the young people began to get digital fatigue. I think that's what they called it. They got fed up doing this, and of course, the social interaction wasn't really there. And they missed that, because the familial side of ensemble, doing things together, is absolutely critical to your own development. And it was for the leaders. Now, only a few weeks ago, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we had a strategic, a strategy meeting with I was the only one from the board. And then there were some of the artistic leaders and also some younger people there. And what was very interesting, it became a therapy session. In other words, this was the first time people had been together in person, and putting it crudely, the shit hit the fan. They had to unload. That wasn't on the agenda, but they had to really share their feelings about what it's been like over the last 2 years. And we never really got much in terms of priorities and strategy. It was just an airing, a clearing the deck. And the two people who were most engaged in some ways were the two young people. We had 2 young people there. They were fantastic with their contribution. And the others were exhausted. Fast forward, this was only about 10 days ago, the 3 main artistic leaders went to Athens. They'd been doing big projects in Athens before the pandemic in the opera, with the Opera House. And they got together. There were homeless people, there were refugees, there were young people. It was a huge mix of people, incredibly demanding. And they were working 12-hour days for 3 or 4 days, and then gave a big performance in the Opera House. And about 250 people came to this. And they came back totally worn out, but re-energized. They suddenly, through this social engagement, realized what they'd been missing and what really matters to them. So after that, when we had our meeting last week, the board meeting, you had re-energized people where their vision returned, and they were reordering their priorities. So I think that doing the stuff together actually really matters. You can only go so far doing what we're doing at the moment. We might have a far more engaged conversation if we were in the same room together, where you could look at people's body language, look at their eyes, and you can really be responsive. And this is very contrived. You can only see half of my body. What about the other half? It's not worth looking at. But, I think that the human interaction really matters. I'll let Sean take up the other point, because I don't want to...
Human and humor, right? Interaction.
No, exactly. I'm just trying to remember the other point you're making, because one thing I just wanted to say in terms of the live and the recorded, I think there's something very powerful that people are returning as people go back into live events. The energy that you get, and that's the other dimension. You know, whether it's just a straight performance concert or whether it's something interactive, which is very much along the lines of what Peter's talking about. You can't. That's the zeitgeist of humanness. That's us as beings, human beings, and what we bring to a room. Connection, and no, however sophisticated our technology, I mean, nothing will ever sort of allow that sort of. It is a more primal connection, and I think that is the basis of how we communicate, and it's the basis of how we make music together as well. So I just wanted to sort of register that. But can you just remind me of the second point you were making, just so I can sort of answer to that as well?
It's Flavia.
Flavia, sorry.
Sorry, I was talking about
Your second point.
It was, let me see, about the success, right? And then I said that perhaps the success of being a human being, and not only about employability that you had mentioned before.
That was it.
That's it.
Thank
you.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, and I think again there was an important point I wanted to make there, in that again we become obsessed with our targets, and of course one of the big things for higher education more generally, certainly in our country, and including conservatoires, is that you need to prove and demonstrate the employability of your students now. There's nothing wrong with that, and of course for the performing arts, music and the performing arts, there are challenges with that. What does employability mean? There's no one job you're going to go into, as we talked about before. But also worse than that is it just becomes a box ticking exercise. You know, you're looking at it from the point of, is this person employed or not, rather than taking a holistic view of what this person, the fulfillment this person is feeling themselves in terms of what they can bring to people and to the outside world, and the sense of potential and your ability to make things happen, to set up opportunities for yourself. Again, it's an overused word, your enterprising, your innovative and your enterprising side. So, but I think it is an important part of this, of your success. It's your own motivation, your ability to take the initiative, to have ideas, to have confidence to bring those ideas, to say yes to things when they come your way, even if you've maybe not done anything quite like that before, or it's moving you into a new territory that makes you a little bit nervous or even uncomfortable. And this is where you need to trust what you have as a human being and the skills you have built up for many years as a musician, and how you can start to use those in lots of different contexts. It's very easy to become an idealist about this, but I still firmly believe that. Times have changed, but it matters even more now. You're coming out of the pandemic, and with many jobs and opportunities, again, in the more traditional sense, not being there at the moment, what are the opportunities that you can create for yourself and critically for other people, which gives you work and makes you employable, but also just brings new things and new possibilities for yourself and others now and into the future. There were very few, next to no, creative music workshops up and running in the mid-late 80s. There were some creative education practice that had been going on since the Second World War, and the writing, but that was of a very particular type. And then there was the community music and the community arts. But actually what came out through the 80s and into the 90s, again, it came back to Peter and a few other people who were beginning to create a whole new area of work and opportunity, which required a different mindset and a different skill set. And I think we're going into another phase of that now. And it's for us to help to define that. It's not to wait for it to happen and say, oh, these are where the jobs are now, so I'll reskill for that. It's more about what's needed. What can we co-create? Back to the partnerships. What can I bring to this? Where can I lead and take the initiative and bring other people in and along with me? And again, conservatoires have a real responsibility, I think, to help create the environments and the forums for that type of thinking to go on.
Flavia, can I just mention a very simple point? What constitutes being a human being? Sean used the word human being several times. I think on the bottom line, and in a way it was subsumed in your question, we need to know what it is to be human and being. Not doing, having, possessing, but being. And this raises whole questions. It's very holistic, the whole mindfulness, and whether you're into Zen or whatever you're into, we need to think very hard about this. And engaging in the arts should really be thinking about what constitutes being human. The being bit is critical. And I think you understand what I'm on about, you know, and the human bit is critical. So it's not about ego. It's not about winning competitions. It's a much deeper sense of trusting, engaging with ordinary people. And I suppose a few musicians. You know, we have to think about them sometimes. But you know, it's a huge issue and it matters. And people like you know, you're having to drive this, and it's not easy. You know that, because the culture of your organizations don't seem to be sensitively aware to these very subtle values and mindsets that really matter. And if you're going to define success, you know, by playing the Sibelius violin concerto in Carnegie Hall, and if that's what success is, and winning, you know, competitions, so be it. But that's a minute mindset which has nothing to do with these wider things. I don't think so. Sorry about this. I do become a bit passionate at times.
It's wonderful. I'm really enjoying it, and it's we actually feel that you both are talking and are pouring your hearts out, and I think this is one of the essence of being human, right? So the being, right, and this is central, and you are just expressing it so wonderful. So just
I think in the jargon, it's a marriage between reflection and reflexivity. I mean, I never quite know what reflexivity is, but psychologists and everyone use this, and philosophers. But it's that subtle dialectic which goes on within all the time, and it's a circular thing, isn't it? It's horizontal, and leadership, in a way, is at the center of a circle, which actually interconnects the voices of everybody. And we get rid immediately of the hierarchy, because the hierarchy is basically soloist. At the bottom, people like you, researchers, educators, therapists, they're at the bottom of the pile in terms of the hierarchy. And I'm off the planet because I'm just a voyeur, a spectator on the whole thing. And you know, you can be very cynical about it, as I am, but you've got to flatten the pyramid. And then you seek your position within this constantly evolving dialectical discourse between people, where you listen and care. And, you know, it's life.
And that, may I just jump into one thing? So if we flatten the pyramid, what about the leaders? Because, or are you talking about shifting leadership and also about leadership?
Yes. The leadership is more inclusive. It has to be inclusive, and that would involve listening to young people. So young people would be part of this circle, a living, breathing organism, which is life. And the damn leaders would have a totally different concept of leadership. This is probably totally non-practical, but actually they would need to listen far more they were there, they would be there. I would probably eliminate quite a lot of committees, because committees are not to do with conversation. I think the culture would have to be radically different, and it won't happen unless there's another pandemic, you know. Maybe that would drive people to this. I don't know. It's a real challenge. I mean, Sean, what do you feel? You are a leader.
No, it's true, and I've said this to Peter more recently, Heloisa and Flavia, that I've just I can talk from the heart, as you can tell, as Peter can, when talking about this work and what it is to be a creative practitioner. You know, the environments, the way of doing, the humanness of it all, and you know, I made a conscious decision a number of years ago to move away from being the practitioner, you know, gradually, not suddenly, and more into the management. You know, partly try to keep the flame alive from when Peter retired, although he's still yet to properly retire. But to build that, but then also the belief that by becoming increasingly part of the leadership team, and now your senior leadership team, you can contribute to that change. I still believe that's possible, but it's proved to be very, very difficult, particularly in the last 2 years since lockdown, because so much of that zeitgeist, that approach one wants to take, you know, how one would approach a workshop, a creative workshop, you know, to me, that's the way you would approach leading and managing things. But that relies again on human contact. You know, you can have so many of these sorts of conversations, but it doesn't allow for the chance encounters, the moments where you can respond. And again, the conversation is different when you're in person. You know, what's come out of the killing of George Floyd and the reignition of Black Lives Matter is crucial and should have happened whether there was a pandemic or not. But it's determined in a way some of the ways this is playing out, you know, and maybe in some ways it's made it more painful, and maybe that's been a good thing because we've not been able to hide behind veneers. It's been much more in your face, but it's also coming with isolation, mental health issues, people feeling alone, and us not being able to sort of be in this together rather than sort of polarized separate sides. So sorry, that I don't want to go off the track. So in terms of leadership now, what I find to be really challenging, and spot on, Peter, with your point about committees, is that I am part of the system. You know, I can be as inclusive and as human and as everything else I want to be, but at the end of the day, I am part of the problem because I sit there at director level, vice principal, and all the rest of it. I'm trying to facilitate equality and inclusion along with the other things I do in the Guildhall. I've been involved with the Barbican on this as well. And you can never, because of the world we're in and the systems we're in, you cannot dissociate yourself from those things. And of course, the other side is a lot of those processes and policies and procedures are put in place for the right reasons, to try and make sure all sides are represented, to be as fair and equitable as possible. But of course, what we don't account for is our own biases, be they personal or group-based or institutional based. And then you come back to, well, what's at the core of a conservatoire? And the 19th century mindset, although people would deny that completely, but a certain type of top-down, welcome to our world, this is our world and this is what we do. And you bluntly, it's not said, but the undercurrent is you either fit or you don't. But then that all starts to play out, and that's what's being challenged, and that's where I failed. I mean, Peter, you quit. I think you remain as forward thinking as anything. But you know, because of who I am and the privilege I have, you know, I've never saw myself. You know, I was part of a generation that was still part of was privileged to social mobility. You know, working class parents. In fact, one who was an immigrant, came from Germany after the war. And you start to, you know, watch families build up their lives, and then their children come through, and you've got some ability. and you end up where you are through that privilege and that journey. But part of that journey is ensuring that you fit in and you can work with the people who are in that environment, who already feel this is how things are done and where all the assumptions play out. And that's actually not been at all helpful in the long run. It may have helped in certain ways, but actually in other ways, that's what's got to be thrown up in the air and completely rethought. Level playing field. That's it. You can still have leaders. A workshop to me is a level playing field. You're in there as equals. The room may turn to you or the leaders of drum heads, the drum works that Peter's talking about, as the person who's going to initiate or catalyze or have something that's going to bring this group together and hopefully lead on a powerful experience and journey. But you are always doing that as an equal human being. And your responsibility as a leader in that context is then to seek out the other extraordinary qualities in the room, where someone could be leading something else and then you're leading from behind or within, or you're not leading at all. But there's a momentum and a direction to it through, again, it's back to through those people in the room, and the way in, the way it's gone, and the way the outcome, the output of that session is framed and captured. Sorry, that's probably more than you needed.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. And I think it resonates so much with us. I mean, me and Flávia, we've been working together for years, and we work with Paulo Freire's, ideas, and it's so much Paulo Freire, this perspective. And
I think we are really, I know we're saying this, but so we get that, and there's that mindset. And I think, although some people just say it as rhetoric without really understanding, a lot of the principles that sit, I don't mean principle as in the values and ethos that you might have in your strategy, they're there and they're believed. The directors who sit around the table, they'll all have their version of it, but they want that to happen. But the culture of the institution and the way that felt is not there. And in a way, that's because that institution was not built on that type of culture. It came from somewhere else, from a different point in history. And there was colonialism, and there was everything else that came with that as well. And that's what we need to find a way around it. I'm not sure it's about burning it all to the ground and starting again, but there are ways. It's back to unlocking, sort of beginning to pull things apart and challenge things and just turn things around so they're relevant to the needs of now and into the future.
Can I mention that the heart of my approach to leadership at the Menuhin School, I'd often talked about this. I call it, just very simply, incidental chatting up. Incidental chatting up. In other words, you're in a corridor, or it was a residential school, so I might be sitting on a child's bed at night, and one would just be chatting. Total equality, they're listening to them. And I think that really was that I really listened to that and tried to build it into kind of policy, if you like. And every Sunday night, we used to have a kind of democratic discussion with all the community. And there were only 40 kids at the school. It was very, very small, from the age of 8 to 19. And that was their opportunity to raise any kinds of issues that were irritating them. And that was fantastic, and I had to listen to this. And if necessary, I would act. I'd provide opportunities to go from this to that, to that, to that, but listening to the kids. And I felt it was a very high profile school. And therefore, it was very important for me to get this human bit right, to compensate for the pressure from the music teachers on their performance. So I was trying to create a human climate in which they would flourish and to compensate in a way for pressure. And so that's a very unique kind of little example. It's much more difficult in a situation that Sean's in and that you're in. And you're not going to get it right. But I think you should have faith in your own instincts and the values you hold. And you obviously care about young people. You care about your music, and you probably care a lot about your society, which is kind of crumbling. You can't resolve all that. But I think you need to have faith in yourselves, what you believe in those colleagues who are closest to you, and the younger people who are close to you, where you're engaging in honest conversation about not just about music, but about life, about things that matter and values. And there's so much to talk about at the moment. And young people have a perspective. You know, they care. Many of them care very deeply, because it's going to be their world. It's not your world. It's going to be their world. So you've got to have faith, I think, in yourselves, in what you believe in, and also have the confidence to share your own vulnerability with people. I think sharing vulnerability is actually part of leadership. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, but you're human. You are vulnerable. This conversation is leading us all into a kind of vulnerability. It's an acceptance of the human condition. So I mustn't get going. Yes, that's another big topic.
Yeah. I think it could be an endless conversation, but we should end. I think it's time now to finish this. Flavia would like to finish with something. Last words.
Well, just a big thank you. Very inspiring. One thing that Heloisa mentioned about Paulo Freire, because many of the things that you guys mentioned really resonates with the Freirean thought. And we have just celebrated 100 years of his birth. So this year we are celebrating Paulo Freire's life, right? So he's still alive for many of us, for us who work with his work, he's still very much alive. And one thing that I think, so he also struggled and fought for that humanization. That was one thing that I think was the core of this conversation, and also hope, right? Because without hope, we cannot do anything. So he would say that he would denounce, right? So always critically denounce the wrongdoings, but also hopefully announcing, so giving a perspective, what can we do? And I think your talk was a little bit of this hope, and it was really nice to listen to different perspectives and about partnerships. So here, as Heloisa mentioned, we work together, we write together, but perhaps we should have like an institutional link between our universities, talking about your institution in Guildhall as well, and thinking that we are in this ABEM conference. So ABEM, as the association of music educators, could also work to help us tie the many links and make us stronger as not only as music educators, but as human beings, right? So thank you very much for being part of this talk.
Must just tell you, in the 1960s and 70s, my Bible was the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire, he was my Bible, along with other people. But I mean, he said it all, and I remember reading it I still got 3 copies up in my home now of the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. No, a great guy, a human being.
Yeah.
Thank you both very, very much. And lovely to hear Sean. I haven't heard Sean for a long time. But thank you for setting this up. It's been very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. You know, I feel very touched because all this conversation, as I said, has a strong resonance with me, and I think with lots of music educators, it will touch. You know, we were in this process in Brazil that's so critical, and then to hear about this possibility of working as a huge community that can link the mind and the heart, like making this bridge. It's very, very important. That it's a way of survival actually in Brazil now, I think, and to have this possibility of working collaboratively, creatively, as a huge group, it's really the way out, I think. So it's really inspiring to hear both of you, and of course we would love to hear more, and our topics actually are much bigger, but we just touched some points, but it was really, really wonderful. Thank you very much for your time and your heart and mind here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been lovely to see you. Other reason to meet you, Flávia. Great.
Marcus and Mario, would you like to come in just to finish this?
Oh, just like to say thank you very much. It was really, really inspiring. We need to think and to act in these ways a lot. Me, as the actual leader of Brazilian Association for Music Education, I learned a lot, and I hope to put some things in action, not just in ABEM, in our association, but in my university as a musician, as a piano player, and as a music educator that is training a lot of young people, of all ages, to be music educators, more committed, more engaged socially, and to understand themselves as part of this world, as part of this change that is possible for us to build this new world that we need to. And so thank you very much. Next, we will have some questions for the audience, and so it will be nice to hear from you again. It was really, really great, and I'd like to thank also Heloisa and Flávia. This is a partnership. This collaborative way of work possibilitated that we are all together here today and heard so many wonderful things, and have so many thoughts to think our way of living, our way of thinking, and be better human beings in this world. So thank you all very, very much for this. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you.
Take care.
Olá a todos. Então, depois de assistirmos a discussão, eu gostaria de convidar para fazer a intermediação aqui de uma continuidade desse debate, convidar as professoras Heloisa Feichas e a professora Flávia Narita. Bom dia, Heloisa. Bom dia, Flávia.
Bom dia. Bom dia.
Oi, gente, okay? Tudo bom?
Então,
tá ótimo.
Tá, beleza.
Ótimo. Eu vou deixar a palavra com vocês para vocês convidarem de volta os nossos convidados.
Welcome, Peter and Sean. Great. Hello. Nice to see you again. So we have just 30 minutes to do this debate, some questions, and then we have to be very focused now. Flávia, could you please say the question and tell them?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much to be here again. So it's a pleasure to see Peter and Sean once again. Thank you, Marcus, and all the organization of ABEM, Heloisa as well. And thank you for the Edneiran's participation here in the chat. And I think that now we might have more people talking to us. But she has sent a question a while ago, and what she commented and asked. So she comments that in a country like ours, so huge of social inequalities, where music schools exclude people, it is necessary to think about this context. So unfortunately, the great majority of music teachers still have that perspective of music for itself and for oneself. So how can we develop this work of conscientization, of awareness, of the social function of art and music?
Sure. You're closer to this than I am.
That's a very interesting question. I think I don't have the answer, but I think for me look, there's a tension here, isn't it? Music for oneself and what that brings, and how that still beholds us almost, I think, to some of our institutions, particularly our training institutions, and what music is to us as people, as human beings outside. One should not negate the other, and one should certainly not cut people off from what they can and they can't do. Everyone has the right to make music and to participate in music, and everyone has the right to experience that in a way that they choose to, and in a way that they can realize their potential through. And that is where our sorts of institutions, I say our because I work at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama, we have a responsibility to ensure everyone does have access to what is there. And as I said, I don't feel I can answer the question in terms of how do we make that happen, because no one person or no one institution can solve that. It has to be done in partnership, in collaboration. What you ask is a musical question, an artistic and a creative question. It's a societal question. It's a human question, and it's a political question as well. So if I was to, having said you can't answer it, the beginning of my answer, and in terms of my experience of how to address this, is that you need to work in partnership. You need to ensure that everyone is in the room, a physical room or a virtual room, and is part of the process of addressing this fundamental question. I think the last thing I will say is, well, and this is more of a personal opinion, as we know, many conservatoires and more traditional music training organizations, the ethos of them still, for me, emanates out of a 19th century, early 20th century tradition in terms of what music education and music training is, and indeed who that is for. We have the rhetoric now, and we have a lot of the language to express ourselves in a way saying we are not that. We are part of the 21st century, and equity and inclusion and the right for participating and engagement in music, whatever your background, whatever genre of music you are interested in, is there. You are able to be part of that. But the reality is there is still a hierarchy and a sort of a less explicit, which can make it difficult sometimes, a less explicit and unspoken hierarchy in terms of what constitutes real music education, and serious music education, and what isn't. And that still requires a lot of work from now and into the future.
Let me translate to people on chat, or I will forget what Sean said. Sorry. Heloisa and Flávia, please help me if I forgot something or if I understood something in the wrong way. Eu vou traduzir para vocês um pouco do que o Sean disse. Ele disse que é uma pergunta muito interessante e que ele não necessariamente tem uma resposta, né? Mas que ele observa uma tensão entre a música para si e a formação musical que é oferecida em algumas instituições e a música para esse engajamento, né? Para poder realizar esse engajamento. Que todos têm o direito de participar da música, todos têm o direito de ter as suas experiências com música da forma com que escolheram fazer. E que nós, e ele diz nós, porque ele trabalha numa dessas instituições, a Guildhall School, nós temos a responsabilidade de oferecer acesso para essas pessoas. E aí, para ele tentar responder essa pergunta da Edneiran, ele diz que isso precisa ser feito a partir de parcerias, a partir de colaboração. Que essa questão, ela é uma questão musical, mas ela também é uma questão da sociedade, ela é uma questão de cultura, ela é uma questão de política, né? Ela é uma questão de humanidade. E a experiência dele, então, é nessa realização de parcerias. E que a gente tem que garantir que todos os que estão dentro da sala, né, assim, uma metáfora de todo mundo que está junto ali fazendo música, nós temos que garantir que todos eles façam parte desse processo. E que muitas das nossas instituições, elas ainda estão presas à ideia de música e de educação musical do século XIX, do século XVIII, né? E nós precisamos compreender que nós estamos no século XXI, que há outras linguagens, há outras formas e que todos têm o direito de participar de tudo isso. E que, na realidade, existe uma hierarquia, né? Uma hierarquia muitas vezes não falada, uma hierarquia implícita, sobre o que é música séria, música de verdade, né? E que nós precisamos, de certa forma, contornar essa hierarquia para promover esse engajamento. Esqueci de alguma coisa?
Não, tá ótimo, muito bom. Eu acho que o Peter quer falar
Yes.
alguma coisa. Peter, would you like to
Yeah,
say
please.
something?
Yes, I'm just going to give a personal story, which one or two of you might have heard before, so maybe it's a bit boring. But I've been committed to what you've all been talking about for 60 years now. And I think it's always quite good. At the heart of the question is really looking at the source of people's motivation. What makes them tick? What really drives them? And I just want to go back to 1961, when I was training to be a teacher at Oxford, and it was World Refugee Year. And quite a lot of students were going out under the banner of the United Nations to build houses for the refugees in Austria living in the camps. And well, I knew I couldn't build a house. If I built a house, it would collapse. So but I did think about taking music out. I could see, you know, there's potential. I had no background in doing this kind of work, but I took in 61 11 musicians out, and in 62 I took 23 musicians out, and we lived in the camps for a month each time. We probably gave nearly 40 concerts at each thing. We were not doing creative engagement. It was pure performance to grandmothers and children and families and these refugees. And the seminal moment in my life was going to a TB sanatorium of tuberculosis behind Salzburg to play to one woman. She was a Hungarian refugee, had been a professional violinist in Vienna, and we went to perform to this one lady. Well, being Hungarian, we played Kodály, obviously, in Bartók. I sang a bit of Lieder, arranged for the quartet, and we did the Haydn Emperor Quartet, which was probably rather stupid because the slow movement is the Austrian national anthem. And that became a highly emotionally charged experience. And it just proved to me the obvious point, the power of music making in ordinary people's lives in an ordinary space is, for me, it's more intense and meaningful than going to a major concert hall. I mean, that's a different experience. This really gets to the heart of music, the point of music, and what it is to be human, and that engagement with music. And that was nothing to do with people's creativity. I mean, that's another issue, which is absolutely kernel. But those experiences, I think one way in for your students, not to mention your staff, is actually to engage with these things, to do it, and do it in a meaningful way. And it's not just going to give a concert. You have to do a lot of homework behind it. You go and develop your partnership, whether it's with a prison or a psychiatric hospital or a home for dementia, whatever you're going to. People, musicians need to be exposed. Well, I think we should all be exposed to these very acute human situations, which are very real. And I think that ignites one's own humanity, and one begins to see your music making in a qualitatively different way. And I think that's crucial. And so I would actually start with the performing in that way, because some of your students might be comfortable with that. You take them to a challenging context, and then they have to really think about that and feel in maybe in a different way. And then they can move on to Sean's area of expertise in terms of creative engagement. And that's another story. But I think people need their motivation to be ignited. And there's no better way of doing that from putting yourself in the deep end in challenging contexts, because that's going to test you to the full.
Fantastic. Sorry, I was muted. I will try to translate again. And Heloisa and Flávia, please help me. O professor disse que ele esteve envolvido com isso por cerca de 6 anos, e que ele sempre se pergunta, né, uma questão: da onde vem a motivação das pessoas, a fonte de motivação, ou seja, o que as motiva a fazer o que fazem. Então, ele lembrou-se de um exemplo em 1961, quando ele estava, acho que estudando para ser professor em Oxford, e havia uma questão com refugiados na Áustria, e eles foram chamados para construir casas para esses refugiados na Áustria. Ele não tinha lá experiência em construir casas, mas ele podia fazer música. E assim ele levou 23 músicos, eles ficaram ali naquela região por cerca de um mês, tocando para avós, para as famílias dos refugiados. E que eles tocaram também para uma húngara, uma moça húngara refugiada, que era violinista profissional. Como ela era húngara, eles tocaram uma peça de Bartók, e que essa foi uma experiência muito forte, e que ali ele pôde ver o poder da música em tocar as pessoas, que é uma experiência diferente, por exemplo, de uma performance numa sala de concertos. Ali, a música foi direto, né, pro coração, que essa é uma outra questão, e que a gente tem que se engajar com música dessas formas diferentes, né? Não só apresentando-se em salas de concerto, mas tendo essas experiências diferentes, levando os nossos estudantes para ter essa experiência, os nossos colegas de equipe, fazer música de forma significativa, fazer o dever de casa e pensar onde que a gente pode fazer esse tipo de coisa. Deixa eu ver aqui. Que estando expostos a essas situações, a gente começa a ver o nosso fazer musical de forma diferente, e a gente começa a se engajar de maneira criativa, e aí a gente pode, inclusive, desenvolver esse engajamento criativo que o Sean disse, e que nós temos que fazer com que as pessoas, e descobrir o que motiva as pessoas a estarem juntas e fazer música dessas formas diferentes, para que a gente repense, inclusive, o próprio fazer musical e o poder que esse fazer musical tem em diferentes circunstâncias.
Só uma coisa, ótimo. Ele falou no início, acho que ele tem 60 anos de experiência com isso.
Ah, sim, beleza.
Só, né?
Eu só acrescentaria a questão da colaboração, né? Ele falou muito do partnership, né? Então, eu falo assim, não é só tocar, né? E não que tocar seja só, né? Mas só que quando a gente toca, além disso, da gente buscar essas parcerias, que ele também falou bastante anteriormente no vídeo que a gente assistiu, né? E de quando a gente é exposto a alguma situação, né, aguda, assim, que provoca essa nossa humanização, essa chamada para a nossa humanidade que desperta na gente. Então, como que a gente pode responder musicalmente a esses chamados? E convenhamos, né, que a gente está numa situação pandêmica e no nosso Brasil a gente tem vários chamados, então vamos acordar aqui, vamos dar as mãos, então essa colaboração, essa parceria, né, eu acho que é realmente esse chamamento, e até relacionando aquela outra pergunta aqui, esse comentário, um outro, né, que a Edina falou, para bem aqui, então vamos continuar, então acho que já é uma primeira chamada aí, né? Obrigada.
Tem uma pergunta aqui, na verdade tem duas perguntas que eu vou traduzir para eles, né? We have two questions now, I think they are related. One is asking, if you have, to what extent Oriental, how I'd say, is Buddhism, contemplative traditions from the East could help. You have some influence from this, you have something from this in your work in terms of a possible path to cultivate and work on this openness to people, I don't know if I translated clearly. And the other one, which is linked to this one, is when we understand music in a holistic perspective, would that include a spiritual dimension of music education? How do you understand spirituality and music education? So it's connected also with this perspective of Buddhism or other contemplative, perspective.
You were nodding, Sean. You were shaking your head. Now, into the world of Buddhism.
Well, I've never quite made it there, but I actually, joking apart, I think this connection between, music making and spirituality, and indeed music education and approaches to music education, I think it's a very important thing. As long as one doesn't become too evangelical about it. We are who we are, and we bring who we are into something. So I just say that as well. But I think this plays back into maybe what Peter and I were saying earlier as well, around the humanism, the human side. There's the spirituality, and I think the otherness of music making, and the otherness of being together, a collective experience. Because for me, when we're talking about music, it's people in the room together. And as you heard us talk about in the film as well, the creative imperative that comes with that music making experience. And that to me is, you cannot always say where that's come from, and it's not something that can be taught. I remember Peter writing this a good few years ago when he was writing one of his many fantastic books or reports about some of the work we were doing through Connect, and young people saying to Peter when he interviewed them, Peter drew the best of these not really young people, teenagers, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, saying for them what they liked about music making, and indeed the approach they were feeling from the music making we were doing with them at the time, is that the music education side, the learning side, if you like, was caught rather than taught. And I think that's a lovely way of putting it. Something that's caught, it's there, it's in the ether, it presents itself in a way that can't necessarily be defined specifically. The non-definability of the experience, the indefinability, and what can be caught, which then effectively becomes a a bit of a personal decision as well. You are engaged, you are part of this experience, you are giving out, you are receiving. What you then draw into that becomes part of your learning, part of your musical experience. But I think there is a spiritual side to that as well. So I'll stop, but I would say, so coming back to the question, right, well, my response to the question is that I think one should allow that to be in play. It's not just the music making, the actual music making. That is a core part of it. But what comes with that, the people in the room, the humanness of it, and the otherness of it, and that's the spirituality part for me, should be allowed to exist. It can be recognized if it feels appropriate to recognize it, and it can be taught and caught and internalized as you go. And I would say our Western culture and our Eurocentric Western culture has perhaps knocked that out of some aspects of music making and music education, because again, I'm not a practicing musician in the way I was and have been in the past, but I've always found, from my experience, musicians who are not locked into a particular pedagogical approach or a particular canon see that as part of the experience. And you will even reference a moment when the spirit has literally touched that group and touched that moment in a music making process. And that's something to be recognized and celebrated and then moved on from. It's not a doctrine. It's something that happens. It's experienced. It's recognized. And then you move on. And that is part of the previous experience.
Well, I can't really, build on that much. I'm a noisy person. And I'm quite good at reading and writing and making a lot of noise about Buddhism and holism and Zen and mindfulness. And I believe in it passionately, but I'm useless at it. Now I go back for another example. When I went to the Yehudi Menuhin school, the one thing I was actually frightened of, and I could have been challenged in many ways, but each day started with silence. Well, can you imagine me starting every day of the week leading a silence? The previous head teacher had been a Quaker, and so silence was absolutely integral to his way of being. And I went to a monastery to learn how to be silent. Well, of course, I came back with lots of poems and prayers and articles about silence. I could have given you a lecture for 10 hours on silence, but I wasn't very good at doing it. And I learnt a little bit about silence, that inner tranquility, inner world, which I think for music making, well, many things in life, but for music making, it's actually essential. I learnt it really from the children. The children were much better at being silent than I was. And when I introduced the course at the Guildhall, and Sean was part of this, do you remember, Sean, we used to start the week with Tai Chi, where I always fell over. And then in the middle of the week, we would have silence. And I don't know whether that worked or not, but it was a collectivity. We were together being quiet. And I think that now a lot of younger people, including, I'm sure, many of your students and many of your staff maybe, are far more in tune with this sense of being and being quiet and mindful. I mean, a lot of the people I meet who are much younger than I am are really very serious about it. And I think in the world we're in at the moment, if I were running a show, I'd make this a very, very important part. You create an environment in which silence, reflection, and the reaching into your inner feelings and not being frightened of these, not being frightened of your vulnerability, that this is actually part of your way of life. Because in a way, I think you're not running a program, you are actually creating conditions to foster a way of life. I think that's what it's about. So it's very human. Again, we've talked about this a lot. Therefore, for me, this is very high priority. All I know, I'm not very good at doing it. But maybe by the time I die, I'll be a bit better.
Thank you so much. I will translate to them. E eu vou precisar da ajuda da Heloisa com a Flávia, porque é muita coisa. Não sei se eu vou guardar tudo, mas vamos lá. O professor Chan, em primeiro lugar, falou, né, dessa conexão com a espiritualidade, a música e a educação musical. Pessoalmente, ele acha isso muito, muito importante. Isso faz parte dessa ideia do humanismo, de ser humano, das coisas que o professor Peter estava dizendo, ou seja, faz parte daquilo que a gente faz, de estar presente naquilo que a gente faz. Que a espiritualidade, ela nos lembra muito da alteridade, né, de estarmos juntos, e dessa alteridade que vem quando fazemos música, quando estamos juntos. E que quando nós experienciamos isso na música, não necessariamente a gente sabe de onde vem, ou a gente consegue falar sobre isso. Que teve uma entrevista que o professor Peter estava fazendo com alguns adolescentes. Eles disseram algo nesse sentido, de que, para eles, o que eles gostam da música, da educação musical, era que essa aprendizagem, aqui é que é difícil passar para o português, mas é que era uma coisa que vinha, mais do que uma coisa falada ou pensada, era algo que vinha para eles, assim, que eles pegavam, mais do que havia conceitos para definir isso, né? E que é parte da nossa decisão pessoal, né, de se engajar, de estar junto, de ser parte desse aprendizado, né, que não é só um fazer musical sonoro, mas é tudo o que vem junto com isso, essa alteridade que vem junto com isso, e que a gente precisa começar a dar mais reconhecimento para essas coisas que vêm junto com o fazer musical, internalizar, pensar mais sobre isso, que a cultura ocidental, na qual nós estamos inseridos, ela não se atenta muito para alguns desses aspectos. Deixa eu ver aqui que eu mesmo não estou entendendo a minha letra. E que a gente precisa reconhecer essa experiência musical, celebrar essas coisas que também acontecem quando estamos juntos, fazendo música juntos. O professor Peter, depois, complementou, dizendo que ele é uma pessoa barulhenta, que ele é bom em ler, em escrever, então ele leu muito sobre o budismo, sobre o zen, etc., e que ele acredita muito disso. E ele deu um exemplo quando ele estava na Yehud Menuhin, que foi muito desafiador, porque todos os dias começavam com silêncio, né? E isso era muito próprio da característica do outro diretor antes dele, e que ele teve que aprender um pouco sobre o silêncio. Então ele estudou, ele leu poesia, né? E ele foi aprendendo um pouco sobre essa quietude, essa tranquilidade que é essencial para o fazer musical. E aí ele comentou que as crianças são melhores em silêncio, no silêncio do que ele. E teve uma experiência numa aula, se não me engano, o professor Chan estava nessa aula, em que eles falaram um pouco de Tai Chi, e que no meio da semana eles treinavam um pouco esse silêncio, fazia esse silêncio, e eles faziam um silêncio juntos, né? E que, para treinar essa experiência, e que hoje as pessoas mais jovens, elas estão um pouco mais atentas a esse tipo de coisa, levando essas questões mais a sério do que se levava anteriormente. E que tudo isso contribui para a criação de uma inovação criativa, de momentos de silêncio, de reflexão, de você olhar para dentro de você mesmo, de você não ter medo da sua falibilidade, que isso faz parte, né, do ser humano, que nós não somos alguém que está rodando um programa, mas que a gente está o tempo todo criando formas de vida, sendo criativos ao criar essas formas de vida. Heloisa, Flávia, alguma correção, alguma complementação?
Não, acho que foi bem resumido aí. Eu estou atenta à hora, porque o Sean tem que sair agora. Just to say that we have to finish, because Sean, we agreed that we should stop now. So I would have more questions, but we'll find another time, another way to keep going with this conversation. And I'd like to thank you so much for being with us today again. And we hope that we can, continue with our conversation, our partnerships.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very, very much. And if you wish to continue the conversation,
yes,
I don't mind people emailing me. Sean's probably very busy, but busier than I am. But if I'm very happy to engage with conversation through email if people want to. And a very big thank you.
Thank you. It's been really, really great.
I will just translate. O professor Peter disse que ele vai ficar muito feliz em continuar essa conversa com vocês por e-mail. Então, a gente depois disponibiliza o e-mail dele para quem tiver interesse. Provavelmente, o professor Sean estará muito mais ocupado por causa das suas atribuições como diretor e vice-diretor das escolas e dos programas. Eles agradeceram muito esse momento e que a gente vai fazer um esforço para continuarmos nesse diálogo, continuarmos nessa parceria para poder vivenciar tudo isso que a gente disse e refletiu sobre hoje de manhã. So thank you a lot, Professor Peter, Professor Sean. We are really very honored, very happy to have you here again. And we hope that we can be together another time and talk a little bit more about all of this, because this was so inspiring for us, and we have a lot to do in this way. So thank you again. Thanks, Heloisa. Thanks, Flávia, for this amazing talk with Professor Peter and Professor Sean. Thank you a lot. Amanhã convido todos para estarem conosco no encerramento, na conferência de encerramento do Congresso, que vai ser proferida pela professora Dalila Andrade, ex-presidente da Associação de Pesquisa e Pós-Graduação em Educação e professora da UFMG. Uma boa tarde para todos e para todas.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.